Understanding depth of field will help you to create impactful photographs. In its simplest definition, depth of field describes the parts of your photographs that are sharp and the parts that aren't. Let's dive into how this works. In every photograph you take, there's a precise focal plane that lies a certain distance away from your camera. By focusing your lens, you can move this plane back and forth in your scene. The area directly around this focal plane goes from sharp to unsharp gradually, creating an area in your scene that appears in focus to the human eye, even if it's not exactly focused. This area is what's known as depth of field. As the photographer, you have control over how shallow or deep the depth of field is, and therefore how much of your scene appears sharp in your photographs. So how do you actually set the depth of field? The first and easiest way is by adjusting the aperture. Wide apertures, represented by low f-stops, produce a shallow depth of field, where only a small section of your scene appears sharp. Narrow apertures, represented by high f-stops, produce a deep depth of field, where most or all of your scene appears sharp. This is because when you close down the aperture, the rays of light from your scene are directed through a smaller hole. This narrows the path of light and increases the distance between the nearest and furthest elements that appear sharp in your scene. Aperture is not the only way to change depth of field. Your other option is to change the camera subject distance, which is the distance between your camera and the focal plane in your image. Or, put more simply, the distance between you and your subject. The closer you are to your subject, the shallower your depth of field will be. You'll notice this if you try to take a very close-up picture of an object, because you'll struggle to get it all to appear sharp. The third way to change depth of field is to adjust the focal length on your lens. If you have a zoom lens, you can do this by zooming in and out. If you're using a prime lens, you'll have to swap out your lens to one with a different focal length. While maintaining the same camera subject distance, a shorter focal length will produce a deeper depth of field, whereas a longer focal length will produce a shallower depth of field. So what does all this mean for you, the photographer? The human eye is naturally drawn to sharpness. So by controlling the depth of field, you're able to control the stories your photographs tell. A narrow depth of field is useful when you want to draw your viewer's eye to something. A deeper depth of field is useful when you want to give the viewer every detail about your scene, from the background to the subject to the foreground.